Let's talk about something uncomfortable but necessary, the energy we waste trying to be understood by people who are committed to misunderstanding us. We've all been there. You start with good intentions, hoping for connection, maybe clarity, but suddenly you're knee-deep in a conversation that feels more like quicksand than dialogue. And before you know it, exhausted, emotionally spun out, and wondering how you got here. At first, you might think you're having a healthy disagreement, two people exchanging different perspectives. But slowly, it starts to shift. You notice they're not really listening to your words, they're scanning them for weaknesses. They're not reflecting, they're reloading. Because to them, this isn't about reaching a shared truth or even mutual clarity, it's about winning. Every point you make is met with a counterpoint, not because it's thoughtful, but because they feel threatened by not having the last word. They interrupt not to clarify, but to dominate. They take your openness as weakness, your questions as invitations to manipulate, and your vulnerability as something to exploit. Their ego is in the driver's seat, steering every word toward control. When someone values being right over being real, they will distort the truth, cherry-pick facts, and even shift goalposts just to maintain power in the moment. It's not just frustrating, it's exhausting. Because deep down, you're not trying to win a fight, you're trying to build a bridge. But they've already burned it, all in the name of pride. Arguing with someone like that isn't a conversation. It's an emotional tug-of-war. And in their mind, if you're not losing, they're not winning. The tragedy? Even when they win, they learn nothing. They gain nothing. And you walk away questioning your sanity when in fact, your clarity was never the problem. It was their inability to meet you with humility. One of the clearest signs you're not in a real conversation is when you're never allowed to finish a thought. You're mid-sentence trying to explain your perspective, and suddenly you're cut off. Not once, not twice, but over and over again. And not because they're curious or excited to connect, because they don't want to hear you. People who argue from ego rather than empathy don't listen to respond, they listen to react. And often, they're not even listening at all. They're scanning for a trigger word or tone they can jump on. They don't process your meaning, they weaponize your wording. That's not conversation, that's manipulation in real time. And when they're not interrupting, they're deflecting. You bring up a valid point, suddenly it's about something you did last year. You express how you feel, they turn the blame around so fast you start questioning if you're the problem. They move the spotlight whenever it gets too hot on their side, and you're left chasing clarity in a house of mirrors. And let's not ignore the talking over. It's loud, it's aggressive, it's meant to drown you out, to dominate. They don't want dialogue, they want control. They raise their volume, not because they're passionate, but because power to them is about silencing others. The more they talk, the smaller they hope you'll feel. But here's the truth. Someone who interrupts, deflects, and overpowers isn't trying to connect with you, they're trying to outshine you. And conversations with people like that leave you feeling invisible, unheard, and depleted. Real dialogue requires presence, it requires pausing, it requires the humility to sit with someone else's truth without rushing to crush it. And anyone who isn't willing to offer you that isn't worth the emotional labor of trying to explain yourself over and over again. At the beginning of a disagreement, you might think presenting facts will help evidence, timelines, examples, even receipts, but the moment you do, something strange happens. Instead of meeting your logic with logic, they shift into emotional chaos. They don't refute your point, they accuse you of being too harsh, negative, or dramatic. Suddenly, you're not discussing the issue, you're defending your tone, your delivery, your character. This is not by accident, this is strategic deflection. When someone can't face the truth, they try to make the truth unbearable. They know they can't win the argument on facts, so they weaponize feelings to flip the conversation upside down. You'll hear things like, wow, you're really angry, when you're simply being assertive. Or, why are you attacking me when all you did was speak calmly and clearly? It's gaslighting with a ribbon on top. And their goal isn't clarity, it's confusion. They want to destabilize you emotionally so the facts no longer feel solid. And it works. You start second guessing yourself, walking on eggshells, worrying more about how you're being perceived than what you actually said. It becomes less about truth and more about managing their outbursts. They'll cry when cornered, not because they're hurt, but because it shifts the power dynamic. They'll turn on the victim mode, spin stories about how you always make them feel unsafe or unheard, even when you've been nothing but grounded and fair. It's emotional manipulation at its finest. Truth becomes the enemy, and you become the villain. But here's what you must remember. Facts don't become invalid just because someone gets emotional. Emotions are real, but they are not always relevant to the issue at hand. And when someone constantly hides behind emotional theatrics to avoid accountability, they're not showing vulnerability, they're showing control masked as fragility. Healthy arguments allow space for both facts and feelings, but when someone consistently weaponizes emotion to escape responsibility, you're not having a dialogue, you're being emotionally blackmailed. And the cost of staying in that cycle is your peace, your power, and your truth. There's a moment in every frustrating argument when you lay it all out. Calm, clearly, truthfully, you present the facts, the timeline, the screenshots, the messages, maybe even your own accountability. You expect, maybe just hope, that now finally they'll see, they'll nod, they'll own their part. But instead, they look at all that clarity and simply shrug, or worse, they deny it entirely. This is not confusion. This is willful ignorance. Some people don't argue because they're uninformed. They argue because they are emotionally allergic to being wrong. Evidence doesn't matter to them. They could be caught red-handed and still twist their way out of it. Why? Because for them, truth isn't a path to growth, it's a threat to their identity. You might find yourself repeating the same facts again and again, thinking maybe they just didn't understand. You rephrase, you soften your tone, you provide more context, but no matter what you do, they're not interested in resolving. They're interested in escaping. They'll nitpick your delivery, accuse you of overreacting, or claim you're making a big deal out of nothing. And here's the heartbreaking part. It's not because they don't see the truth. It's because they do, and they're actively rejecting it. You cannot reason with someone whose mind is already made up, especially when it's been built on ego, not integrity. And when someone repeatedly refuses to acknowledge evidence, they're not protecting themselves from shame, they're protecting the fragile fantasy of who they believe they are. This is the kind of person who will rewrite history just to stay comfortable. They'll gaslight you by saying that never happened, even when it did. They'll dismiss your memory and even your proof just to preserve the illusion of control. It's not just dishonest, it's deeply manipulative. But here's the truth. Evidence is not for people who refuse to grow. It's for you to remind yourself that you're not crazy, you're not overreacting, and you're not wrong for expecting honesty and accountability. It's there to anchor you when someone else is trying to push you off center. Stop exhausting yourself trying to convince someone who is committed to denying reality. It's not your job to teach someone the truth they're determined not to learn. It's your job to protect your peace when you realize they never came to learn, they came to win. There's a very specific kind of exhaustion that comes from arguing with someone who keeps saying the same thing over and over while completely ignoring everything you've said. It's like talking to a wall with a built-in loudspeaker. No matter how thoughtful, calm, or clear your response is, they just loop back to their original point, word for word, as if the conversation never moved forward. This isn't forgetfulness, it's a tactic. Repetition in arguments isn't always about memory. Often it's about control. It's about anchoring the conversation in their version of reality and refusing to step outside of it. You might try to explore nuance, offer evidence, or introduce empathy, but none of it sticks because they never actually hear you. They're not participating in the dialogue. They're just broadcasting. They repeat themselves not to clarify, but to dominate, because if they say it enough times, they believe it'll somehow become the only truth in the room. And while you're trying to build understanding, they're standing still clinging to the same sentence like a lifeline. Why? because acknowledging your point would require self-reflection. It would require growth, and growth feels like danger to someone whose self-worth is built on being right. And here's the real kicker. The more you try to engage with their logic, the more they retreat into their loop. You say, I hear you, but here's what I'm saying. And before you even finish, they're back to their script. You start to feel like you're explaining things in circles, like you're the only one trying to move forward. And you're not wrong. When someone is emotionally immature or intellectually dishonest, they don't argue to grow, they argue to stall. Repeating themselves allows them to avoid accountability without looking hostile. It's passive resistance dressed up as confusion. And slowly you'll start to feel yourself unraveled, not because your points aren't valid, but because you're trying to build a bridge to someone who keeps tearing it down and pretending they're still standing on it with you. But here's what you need to know. Your clarity is not the problem if they can't or won't engage with your words. It's not because you're confusing, it's because they've chosen not to listen. True dialogue is a dance, not a loop, and if someone refuses to meet you in the middle, repeating themselves instead of reflecting, then it's not a conversation, it's a performance. And the smartest thing you can do is step off the stage. When someone lacks the depth, insight, or emotional maturity to meet your argument with substance, they resort to the cheapest weapon available, making it personal. You'll notice that the moment they start to lose ground, the facts aren't working in their favor, the logic isn't on their side, they feel exposed, and instead of engaging with your actual point, they pivot to you. Not your idea, you, your tone, your flaws, your past, your character, your identity, anything to drag the spotlight off the truth and onto your supposed defects. It's not about the conversation anymore. It becomes an attack on who you are. They'll say things like, you always do this, or that's why no one can talk to you. Suddenly you're being psychoanalyzed by someone who refuses to reflect on their own behavior. Suddenly your intelligence is questioned. Your intentions are picked apart. And all you're trying to do is have a real conversation. But let's call it what it is, deflection wrapped in cruelty. They make it personal because that's the only ground they feel powerful on. If they can't outsmart you, they'll try to out-insult you. If they can't break your point, they'll try to break your spirit. It's not a discussion anymore, it's a demolition. And what they're really trying to destroy isn't your logic, it's your confidence. And here's the most dangerous part. It works if you're not careful. You might start defending your tone, your personality, your past decisions. You might even start to question your worth. And that's when they win, not because they were right, but because they distracted you from your truth. But here's the reality. When someone makes it personal, they're not revealing anything about you. They're revealing everything about themselves, their inability to sit with discomfort, their lack of emotional tools, their fear of being seen for who they really are, because substance requires vulnerability, and that's something they've never learned how to hold. You don't have to prove yourself to people who fight dirty just to avoid looking inward. You don't need to dignify attacks disguised as arguments. You can disengage, not because you've lost, but because your energy is too sacred for someone who doesn't know the difference between a debate and a takedown. When they go low, don't go lower. Go silent, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. Because nothing confuses a person with no substance more than someone who refuses to fight back in the mud they're swimming in. The truth is, not every